From the French ancient philosophers to the grammarians of through the 20th, 21st century, from the grammarians that studied classical languages like Greek and Sanskrit and Tamil, to people who study Andamanese, Hindi, English even, the question of what are the basic units of grammatical analysis has been a very important one. For most of the duration of our this inquiry, our focus has been on what are the basic parts of speech, because those were understood by our ancient scholars and medieval scholars to give it the grasp of what is a grammatical category. I am going to present to you a certain reading of this tradition in which the movement has been away from parts of speech. The notions of parts of speech still remain to be relevant for areas like computational linguistics. We will begin in this first unit with a look at the classical traditions. In the study of the basic units of grammar, that is, in the study of grammatical categories, both ancient and modern traditions have grappled with what is going to be the unit from which all analysis should start. Whether it is from the classical languages like Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Pali, or whether it is from the study of modern languages in the 19th and 20th century, grammarians have settled on what they consider to be the starting points of linguistic analysis. For close to 20 centuries in the Western tradition, the notion of basic part of speech was crucial. But the Sanskrit and the Pali and the traditions that are derived from it differed quite significantly, because they took units below the word also as the basis for analysis. In this first unit, we shall be tracing what that understanding has been. For ease of presentation, we will start with the younger of the two traditions, which is the Greek and Latin traditions. For both Plato and Aristotle, right, the basic categories of grammatical analysis were defined by both morphology and syntax. And Cratylus, Plato, characterized the sentences having two major components: a nominal one, which was called onoma, and a verbal one, which is called rima. Aristotle in Poetics, which is about another 30-40 years later, defined significantly expanded this list now to comprise of a total of 8 categories corresponding to the various stages in the composition of language as he conceived it. Right? This list included phoneme, syllable, proposition, preposition, adverb, article, conjunction, tosis, which is case, onoma, which is noun, rima, which is verb, and logos, which variously represented sentences, discourse, that is a part or a unit that is incapable of independent co-signification. So while in the Aristotelian conception, the basic units of linguistic analysis could make reference to form, syntactic function, and or syntactic lexical meaning, it is Dionysius of Thrax in the 100 BCE who is widely acknowledged to be the most influential grammarian with respect to modern grammatical categories. In the art of grammar, which is the first extant grammar of Greek, Thrax lists 8 parts of speech. So onoma, rima. Onoma is a noun, which is a part of speech rather, which signifies a person or a thing, which is inflected for case and number, etc. And a verb, that is rima, on the other hand, is a part of speech without case inflection, but has inflections for tense, person, etc. Included in this list are participles, articles, pronouns, prepositions, adverbs, and conjunctions. Okay. So Thrax's attempts to in the area of grammatical categories or parts of speech is an attempt to tidy up Aristotle's definition so that morphological criteria and lexical semantic criteria are applied uniformly. Okay. And so the primary basis by which he defines his parts of speech are by form, by syntactic function, and meaning. Okay. Axis system, nouns and verbs are defined in terms of complete morphological criteria such as presence or absence of inflection, therefore unifying things like participles with nouns, but also with verbs because they share a common semantic property. Okay. This cleaning up of Aristotle's ideas tries to impose a uniform criterion by which you can identify parts of speech. However, there is some overlap because something like a participle has both the properties of nouns and verbs. So Dionysius of Thrax, which grammar of Greek, also sets the stage for a for departure, because as the Greek civilization waned and we moved towards the Latin system, the basis by which you would identify the linguistic basis for the identification of parts of speech shifted. Latin, as is well known, is a language without articles, and this led Priscian, around 500 AD, given the empirical facts of Latin, he felt bound to actually give up the notion of an article. In other respects, however, the tradition was not really affected. So, because there was an irrational adherence to the magic figure of 8. And so, for some reason, grammarians thenceforth, right up to the 20th century, but certainly up to the 18th century, as you can see with the work of J.B. Priestley, cannot remove. They speak a language. He speaks a language, English, which has articles. But once Priscian removed them, Priestley did not feel that he had the grammatical sanction to be able to reintroduce articles. So, by the 18th and 19th centuries, Greek and Latin were crippling the grammatical description of English because they represented two models. One for a language with articles and a highly inflectional system, and one which is without language of articles, also without articles, but also a highly inflectional system. The Sanskrit tradition, on the other hand, which I have already said is older, was not so burdened at all, because that a decision was made early on in that grammatical system to, in effect, give up notional definitions of what is a noun, a verb, etc. So rather than relying on linguistic semantic definitions, they relied on purely form-related definitions. The beginning of this tradition, as far as we know, because there is a lot, it's a very old tradition, and the beginning of this tradition with Yaska's etymological work, which is around 600 to 500 BC, used, like the Aristotelian Plato tradition, use ontology and morphology to define the basic parts of speech. So Yask divides the basic units of the analysis of meaning and form, that is the analysis of sentences, as to have 4 basic grammatical categories: nama, noun; akhyata, verbs; upasarga, preverbs or prefixes; and nipata, particles or other invariant or indeclinable verbs. For Yask, the distinction of between nouns and verbs does not lie in morphology, but in ontology, that is, in the world. And because he considers the world to be composed of 2 distinct types of existences: a process or an action, a bhava, and an entity or a being or a thing, which sattva. These 2 ontologically distinct expressions then have distinct realizations in the world of grammar, and they can have different expressions in morphological form. but that's not the focus, because the upasarga and nipata are not described in terms of ontology, but described in terms of purely morphology. So upasarga is a morphologically bound form, and the nipata is an indeclinable and standalone kind of form. The most well-known successor of Vyaska is Panini, though the tradition had a greater depth than that. And his perspective differs from Vyaska in two important respects. First, for Panini, linguistic meaning does not lie in the world, but in words, but in sentences. So therefore, ontological definitions, which are putatively word-level referentially based, do not have a value for the Paninian system. For Panini, distinguishing between a noun or a verb has no value really in describing the world, and in grammar, what this just means is that they exist as two separate lists. So Panini's Ashtadhyayi makes no attempt to define what a noun or verb is, rather it just provides two lists of nominal roots and verbal roots, the Ganapatha and the Dhatupatha. Right? And there's a system of grammatical rule which allows for the addition of affixes to be able to derive the forms that are used in grammar. So, in distinction to Vyaska, who the properties of nounness and verbhood arise from the interaction between the world and language, in the Paninian system, the distinction is internal to language itself and really expressed through the existence of two separate categories of inflection / derivation. So, in modern terms, you can say the lexicon just contains two lists. Right? The basic units that are input in the Paninian system, there are about a 4,000 odd system of rules in the Ashtadhyayi, however, are not words, but units below the word. Panini's grammar analyzes sentences starting from the phonemic level, right, and has 4 levels of hierarchically organized description, and with each level really preserving the information achieved thus far. Okay. So it does not privilege the word as the basic unit of analysis. Panini's system is essentially an item and process system, and as a consequence, unreal things, that is, things that do not have a actual physical acoustic description, some things like abstract tense affixes, also exist within the Paninian system, precisely because there is no relation that the word legitimizes the word or the units below it. In fact, those abstract tense suffixes, as Paul Kiparsky has shown, are treated at par with inflectional items that focus in terms of morphological form. In this system, probable parts of speech are irrelevant because the unit is much smaller than the part of speech. This tradition, the Paninian intellectual tradition, reached the West only at around the 18th and 19th century, and perhaps it is not too much to say that this had an indirect impact on the way that grammatical categories began to be perceived. Not only was the magical figure of 8 in the 19th, 20th and 21st century challenged by grammatical work which look in languages looking at languages like English, which were not Greco-Latin, but also the colonial encounter that took place in the 19th and 20th centuries of the European world with other languages, like indigenous languages of the Asias and Americas, led to, one would say, a churning amongst grammarians in trying to understand that what would be the basic units of sentence analysis on a more universal level than just Greek, Latin and maybe English. So these all led I believe, to a grammatical, to a reevaluation of the Greek-Latin tradition, and the modern grammarians' critique of the classical tradition became the basis by which now parts of speech would be thought about. Some of this critique and inquiry came from the tradition of in the American tradition, and the structuralist tradition, which was really at the forefront, if you want, of the colonial encounter with other languages. One such approach is of Henry Sweet in 1845, who lived between 1845 and 1912. Okay. Sweet's aim was to find grammatical units that could be objectively observed, that were not based on criteria, ad hoc criteria, notional criteria in particular, developed by individual grammarians, but that which could be objectively measured, verified, observed, quantified. And Sweet held that linguistic form and regularity of meaning were the basis of such identification. Okay. So the abandonment of imprecise formal criteria really begins with Henry Sweet. In Sweet's view, parts of speech were not the starting point of grammatical category, but really a midpoint or even an end point in if you were creating a lexicon. Right? Sweet observed that given that language and grammar are not concerned with form and meaning separately, but with the connections between them, the study of grammar must be purely descriptive. So a consideration of form leads Sweet to identify what are grammatical categories. And so what he suggests is that we look first to see an objective categories, whether they are declinable or indeclinable. That is, whether they are capable of inflections or not. And it's only after such classification that parts of speech can be identified, okay, by using the following criteria. These criteria are whether they have inflection of their own distinct from the other parts of speech, so that is, do they form an inflectional class. He also observes that each part of speech has special forms, words associated with it. So some consideration of syntax, because what was meant here by special form words, that could some indeclinables go with a certain part of speech. For example, articles would only go with a nominal part of speech. Okay. And also more rigorous considerations of syntax, that is, what syntactic positions that they occur in. So more or less a definite position in the sentence. Okay. Sweet's criterion of indeclinability is morphological, right? Whereas the criteria that whether there are form words that are associated with it and what is its positions that this particular part of speech take in the sentence, are these criteria are syntactic. So the first criterion of which is that having the association as form words relates with a phrasal level category, and the second criteria is the ordering of phrases vis-a-vis each other. Now, what Sweet's study does is lump together, if you want, nouns and verbs, because they are both declinable, right? And distinguishes them from the indeclinable propositions. It also uses meaning as a secondary criteria, because it's lexical, and relatedness of meaning as a secondary criteria, because it requires that this separates nouns from verbs and verbs from prepositions and prepositions from articles. Sweet's categories also, however, conformed to the magical figure of 8, which was an arbitrary restriction. And in his framework, you had overlap between parts of speech. So an infinitive, for example, is a part of speech which can be both a noun and a verb. In all, these 8 parts of speech did by the methodology they were used, was used to identify them, that these represented a major departure from the classical tradition. So in Sweet's classification, there were 8 categories. So they're what he called noun words, which included nouns, pronouns, nouns and numerals, infinitives and gerunds. Adjective words, which were adjectives, adjective pronouns, adjective numerals, etc. Verbs, which were in Sweet's classification only about finite verbs, but also included verbals, infinitives, gerunds and participles, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions and interjections. Note here that even though he is describing a language like English, he doesn't have article as a basic part of speech, because once in adherence to the tradition that was started with Priscian, that you remove article, and therefore Sweet's list also does not include articles. Okay, so this concludes our brief survey of the grammatical tradition from till the 20th century.